Hello, I'm Locke, Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where we're very pleased to have on the show our United States Senator David Vitter. David's going to talk to us about the big issues that are facing our federal government, our nation as a whole. He's going to talk about the economy, debt, and he's also going to talk about the fact that we have a lot of tensions overseas in the Middle East, a lot of war going on. So join us on the next Legal Lines with our United States Senator David Vitter. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. We're very pleased to have on the show today our United States Senator David Vitter. David.
Hey, Locke. Great to be with you.
Good to see you again.
Thank you for the invitation to come back.
Well, a lot of stuff is going on.
Yeah.
And I wanted just to have a chance for you to explain to the folks kind of where we are in 3 or 4 major areas.
Sure.
Before we dive into that, just educate them real fast on what your background is and your education.
Yeah, I grew up in Louisiana. I've always lived here all my life except for college, and grew up in the greater New Orleans area. Then went away to college at Harvard University undergrad, then went further away. I was very blessed to win a Rhodes Scholarship and studied at Oxford in England for 2 years, which was a wonderful experience in all sorts of ways, including outside the classroom. And then I came full circle, came back home and got a law degree at Tulane.
And David, it's important to point out, you never say it, but you had many awards and accolades during that period of time.
Go ahead and tell the folks. I worked hard, and that was recognized, which is nice. I usually don't bring that up because I want to preserve a political career here in Louisiana. I don't want to ruin anything. But I thought from high school on about wanting to come back and live here. I love Louisiana, and I often thought, we have so many enormous strengths: natural resources, culture, history, and most of all, our people. Wonderful people with great personality and attitude and great strengths. And to me, as I grew up here, the thing that was really holding us back was our political culture. Mm-hmm. A culture in the past really rooted too often in corruption and cronyism, and I wanted to be some small part of changing that.
And so you've been, frankly, a huge part of changing that, both here in the state level and at the federal level.
Well, the good news is I really think we've turned a corner as a state, getting away from the negative aspects of that political tradition of culture and cronyism, really building a new tradition, a reform tradition built around conservative reform values that match Louisiana. So I'm excited about that.
David, and we've discussed this in the past, but you are uniquely qualified in that some of your studies were in economics.
Yeah, I studied a lot of history and a lot of economics, and both of those I think have served me well. Certainly these economic issues always come up, particularly now that we're in a horrible economy, trying to get out of the remainder of this recession, trying to grow jobs in the economy.
And let's kind of talk about that.
Sure.
Let's educate the folks on what the economy is. I mean, let's just define that for them. Yeah. What is the economy?
Well, it's all goods and services, exchange, buying and selling, everything we're involved in on the commerce side. And again, right now we have an enormous challenge trying to come out of what has been the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, economists will say we're no longer in a recession.
Right.
But it still
sure doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, it still feels like a recession. It's a very slow, very sluggish economy. And a lot of folks, including economists, say instead of what's a normal V-shaped curve, you go down into recession, you turn the corner, you come back up. We seem to be stuck in more of an L shape. We went down for sure.
Right.
And hopefully we've hit bottom. Hopefully we're not going to go down further.
But there's a little bit of fear
there. We seem to be coming across and not really going up in a substantial way.
Dr. Lauren Scott said the exact same thing last month.
Yeah. Some other folks call it a jobless recovery. We're out of the recession technically, But where's the job creation? Job growth is still very, very sluggish, and that's what impacts families' daily lives.
David, when they say we're out of the recession, what's their definition or criteria to make that determination? And who says that?
Yeah, there are formal economic rules and guides about what that means, and it has to do with GDP growth. But again, sometimes you can have that growth and still have a jobless recovery, or even if you meet that metric with regard to gross domestic product, the jobs lag. And so that's where the rubber hits the road. That's what really impacts people's lives and families. It is jobs, job growth. That's still very sluggish. We've seen a little bit of growth. Unemployment nationally has come down recently to 8.3%, but over 8% is still horrendous. And when you consider the number of folks not looking at all, another whole category, the number of folks who are underemployed, working some but not nearly what they want to work, it's still a very, very soft economy.
Well, and I've been reading that when you, if you quit looking for work after a month, you're no longer counted.
No, you're not counted
and
at
so
all.
When we say the unemployment rate has dropped down to 8.3, that's based on the number of folks they say who are still looking for a job.
Right.
And it excludes the folks who have quit looking for a job only after a month. Correct. And like you said, those who are not fully employed, they're underemployed.
Correct.
If you include those folks, the rate's what, about 15%?
Oh, and I've even heard 17%, particularly in a very bad recession and in a long recession like this. A lot of folks quit looking actively. They're very discouraged, and so that figure grows even more.
So kind of to summarize, I think what you've said, in my mind, basically the economy is a technical word for employers using employees to produce services and goods.
Absolutely.
And you need sellers of those goods and services, and you need buyers.
Right.
And our buyers come from where?
Well, our buyers are, first of all, at home, all of us as consumers. That's the most important base. And then, of course, some industries, we export product to other consumers around the world. We don't do nearly as much of that as we'd like to. We have a balance of payments problem, although it's been getting a little better recently. But so our buyers are both at home and abroad, anybody who consumes, who buys our goods and services.
And so if, for example, you got folks here in Louisiana who don't have a job, they're not going to be buying a whole lot.
That's right.
And if you've got other countries who are in a recession or whose finances are collapsing like they're talking about occurring in the European Union, you got no buyers, or your number of buyers are going down.
That's right. And this has been a major worldwide recession that we're trying to get out of, and that has impacted us a lot. Then in addition, there are troubles brewing elsewhere, Greece and Spain and Portugal, about the size of their debt. And of course, we have a debt problem too. And that also is a threat to us.
So what is the government's role, but local, state, and on the federal level, but let's talk about the federal level, in dealing with the economy and helping create an environment for jobs?
It's one of those fundamental things that I think most Republicans and conservatives have a certain view of, and most national Democrats and liberals have a different view of. On the left, a lot of folks would say the government's role is to hire people, is to invest in certain industries, is to get very directly involved in a lot of this economic activity. As a conservative, I would say something different. The government's role is to create a climate and create policy that encourages private sector growth, job creation, expansion. I would always focus on the private sector as the real engine of our American economy, and the government's role is to create the right policy to allow the private sector to grow and to thrive.
And so I guess based on the fact that for several years the Democrats were in control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they implemented their policies over the last several years, and it doesn't seem to have helped. Let's discuss that on the next segment.
Sure.
This is Locke Meredith on Legal Lines with our United States Senator David Vitter. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke, Meredith, and again, very pleased to have on the show today our United States Senator David Vitter. David, let's dive back into it.
Absolutely.
We were talking about what is the government's role in helping the economy, which is basically helping employees hire employees.
Right.
So tell me the difference between the liberal or Democratic view versus a conservative / maybe Republican view.
Well, nationally and in Washington, I think liberals want the government to be very directly involved in hiring, in owning some parts of industry, in investing, in bailing out big players in the economy, including banks, in directly hiring people. Conservatives, on the other hand, want government to set the right policy that encourages private sector growth and vitality. And I think that's a main, pretty fundamental difference. Now, that difference, I think, has never been more stark than in the debate over the last few years, particularly coming out of the financial crisis. 2008, it's beyond dispute. We had a major financial crisis in late 2008, and that led to the bailouts and some of that unprecedented U.S. federal government role in the economy. I was very concerned about those proposals from the beginning. I voted against all of the bailouts because I feared that over the long term we were going to increase permanently, not temporarily, permanently increase the federal government's role and dominance over the economy. I think, unfortunately, that's proven right, at least so far, because you had that crisis, and then right at the same time, Barack Obama was elected president. And he really used the opportunity to dramatically increase the role and scope of the federal government with bailouts, with major spending programs, with dramatic increases.
Purchases of private businesses, in fact.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking of the auto industry.
Yeah. And so I think you really have had a shift in terms of the dominance of the federal government in the private marketplace.
Now, I've heard, and it's the facts, that the bottom line is this occurred while President Bush was there, and they're saying, hey, the reason we collapsed was because you Republicans were in charge and y'all created this environment. What is your response to that?
Well, if you look at the financial crisis, there were a lot of causes, but some of the causes were on the government side, and it wasn't conservative policy, quite frankly.
So what was it?
It was a lot of policy built up over years that demanded, for instance, that in the home mortgage business, that everybody deserved a home and deserved home ownership and a mortgage no matter their ability to pay. That instituted a lot of political tests for that rather than market tests, and that led over time to unsound loans.
Bottom line is banks, if I'm hearing you right, banks were pretty much forced or coerced by the federal government to make loans to folks who normally wouldn't qualify?
Yeah, in many cases that's right. The two biggest areas of that policy are something that's been around for years called the Community Reinvestment Act, where banks are essentially graded and forced to make certain transactions they wouldn't otherwise make. And secondly, the dramatic growth of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are essentially big institutions for home mortgages that were backed implicitly, but now almost explicitly by the federal taxpayer.
Almost like, I think of it as an insurance company in essence, that if these loans go bad, we're going to make you whole. We're going to pay for it.
Yeah, and the federal
taxpayer. The taxpayer.
Yeah, the taxpayer was the one on the hook behind that. So on the government side, I think those were some of the big forces that led to that 2008 crisis. Then on the private side, there were other things that clearly got out of hand and mushroomed.
I have read, David, recently that with the bailout funds that were spent to deal with the housing market, the federal government could have bought 10 million homes.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money.
It's incredible.
It's a huge amount of money. And again, my concern from the beginning was this huge growth of the dominance and power of the federal government directly in the private economy.
I guess what's frustrating me is I'm going, we spent enough money, the federal government, our tax dollars, to buy 10 million homes, and we still have the worst housing crisis. Nothing's changed. It hasn't improved. There are 1 million foreclosures on the books.
And part of the reason is if you look at President Obama's response and how a lot of that money has been spent, it's just been growing government, everything in sight. You know, the stimulus plan was his first big push upon coming into office. That was a $1 trillion bill. When you count the interest to borrow that money, because it was all borrowed money, it was over $1 trillion. Now, it's hard to wrap your head around what that means, but I'll give you one small example. If somebody in the day of Jesus Christ had started spending $1 million a day, $1 million a day from Christ's time, we wouldn't be up to that amount of money yet.
$1 trillion.
It's a lot of money.
Holy
and again,
moly.
it wasn't focused on specific needs, specific priorities, specific programs. It was really used, in my opinion, to grow government, the federal government, everything in sight. And so it just boosted the federal budget and almost every federal program in sight. Because of that, what happened is what I feared. I voted against the stimulus plan because I knew it would make one dramatic change. Deficit and debt would go through the roof, which it did, $1 trillion overnight. But in terms of job creation, it did very little for that. President promised it would keep unemployment below 8%. Unemployment then was below 8%. He said it would get us back down to that level, and of course it still hasn't done that for a long time. We were hovering near 10%.
I've actually read that the average of the economy that the federal government generates was about 20%, 18%.
Yeah.
It's now 25 or 26%.
Yeah. That's a major growth in just a few years. And I think we need to be very concerned that that's going to be a permanent shift and not a temporary response to a crisis.
You mentioned the debt. Let's kind of try and tackle that, because we hear the terms the national debt and the deficit. Yeah. Distinguish or explain the difference between the deficit and the debt.
Yeah. Well, the deficit is 1 year. It's how much we're borrowing in this single year at the federal level to cover what revenues do not cover.
So what is it? What are the numbers this year?
Well, it's over $1 trillion. That's several times years in a row, it's been over $1 trillion. We broke that line a few years ago, and now we've done that year after year after year. So that's the deficit, 1 year. The debt is that accumulating over time. So obviously, if you have a deficit of over $1 trillion several years in a row, you're putting $1 trillion on top of $1 trillion on top of another trillion. Our debt is now well over $15 trillion.
And approaching 16 at the end of this year, right?
Approaching 16, and over the next 10 years, if we stay on the unsustainable fiscal path we're on, we'll add another $9 trillion in 10 years. So it's really a completely unsustainable path.
So to summarize the deficit, let's say the government says we're going to spend $3.5 trillion this year. They only receive tax revenues of $2 trillion. So they have to go borrow the other $1.5 trillion.
The remainder is borrowed money.
And where are we getting that?
Deficit. We get it from anybody who buys U.S. Treasury bills, basically, which is a form of a loan. Now, that's a lot of American citizens, great. It's also a lot of folks outside this country, including the Chinese. They own a huge amount of our debt. So we're beholden to them because they're like the bank, and we owe them money.
Let's continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith, Legal Lines. Our United States Senator David Vitter. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, so pleased to have on the show our United States Senator David Vitter. David,
thank you again, Locke, for the invitation.
Thanks so much for coming in.
I really appreciate it.
Let's continue this, and I know it's kind of technical and complicated, but it's really important. So what are the consequences of our federal government having to borrow every year over $1 trillion to the point now that we're approaching 16 trillion in debt?
Well, it's just like a family or a small business in some sense. If you have that level of debt, after a while it's unsustainable. First of all, it grows and grows and grows, and it just becomes unsustainable. Right now, our debt is as big as our whole economy for a year, our GDP.
It's never happened like that, right?
Well, it's happened once before for a pretty good reason. It happened in World War II.
That's right.
When we had to build a modern army overnight to defeat Hitler. Now, if you're going to go into debt, that's a pretty good reason you have to do it. Because we didn't have a modern army. We literally had to build that overnight to defeat Hitler. We had to borrow a lot of money to do it, and then we paid it back in the 50s with a very healthy economy. But now we have a level of debt comparable to that. We're not in the middle of World War II. We have our challenges, including internationally, but we don't have that level of challenge. And so this amount of debt is just huge.
Of course, the Democrat folks would say, well, we are at war, and that's the reason we have this level of debt. What is the response to that?
Well, that's part of the reason, and we are at war, and it's a serious challenge. I don't think it's comparable to building a modern army overnight to defeat Hitler, so I don't think it's that level of historical reason. The biggest reason, and this pre-existed the war on terror, the biggest reason is Washington has just lost all fiscal discipline. People say yes and yes and yes to every interest group in sight, every spending program in sight, with no way to pay for it.
And I've read, and you're in the Senate has not given a budget.
Correct.
Since President Obama was elected.
Yes. The Senate has not even tried, majority leader, the Democratic majority has not even tried to pass a budget in 2.5 years. They're not even trying. Now again, at home that doesn't work. You don't just forego even having a budget plan. If you run a Louisiana small business, that doesn't work. You have to start with a realistic budget plan. In the Senate, Harry Reid and the Democratic majority have just thrown up their hands, aren't even trying.
So our government is borrowing 40 cents or 45 cents of every dollar they spend. And that translates, I have read, into every single United States citizen, a baby born today to the 99-year-old person, of $46,000 to $50,000 per person.
Yes. Just a few years ago, it was about 28. That was really high. But it has almost doubled in just a few years. This problem has exploded. Absolutely exploded.
It's going to consume our nation if we don't do something.
Yeah, just a few years ago, this was a problem, but we would talk about the burden we were leaving to our grandkids. It's not a grandkids issue anymore. It's an us issue. This threatens to be an immediate crisis. I don't know when. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know when it will lead to that sort of crisis atmosphere, but that will happen given the path we're on. It's not a question of if, it is a question of when. And we just have to look to Europe to see that crisis.
They're collapsing over there because they were basically what's called an entitlement society. Born till your death, we're going to provide benefits to you. So, huge problem, $50,000, $60,000 to every single U.S. citizen. What do we do to fix this?
Well, real broadly speaking, we need to do two things at the same time. We need real cuts, real fiscal discipline.
So what have they been talking about, David? They come out and say, we've cut
They've been talking about Washington cuts. And a Washington cut is you have spending growing at 9% a year and you cut it to 8%.
So they're cutting the growth of expenditure.
That's not a real world cut. That is a Washington cut. We need real cuts, and at the same time, we need real, robust economic growth. You can't just cut your way out of it because the hole is too deep if we have a bad economy. And you can't just grow your way out of it if you continue this spending pattern as we have over the last several years in particular. We need both at the same time.
So where would you say cuts need to happen immediately?
Well, everything needs to be on the table. For instance, I'm a big defense hawk, and I certainly favor a strong military.
But that's a big hit, right?
Yeah, but that's a big part of the budget, and that needs to be on the table. There is real fraud and waste and abuse at the Pentagon. We need to root that out. I don't think we should just chop things across the board and hurt a lot of muscle and bone as well as fat, but we need to surgically go in and go after that waste. That can be real dollars at the Pentagon and elsewhere. Ultimately, the biggest piece of the pie is what's usually called mandatory spending or so-called entitlement programs. Big programs including Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. That's a big, big part of the budget. So we need to reform the system, not just to cut and save money, but to save those programs. Because if those programs aren't reformed, they won't be around for the next generation.
David, if I recall, there was this super committee that was going to come up with recommendations, or actually a very powerful committee, and they didn't make it happen. And as a result, automatic cuts are set to take effect 50-50 between those entitlement programs and the military.
Correct.
Now that occurs at the end of this year, or when?
2013. That occurs in 2013. I didn't vote for that bill establishing the super committee because, number one, I thought the upfront cuts were almost non-existent, and number two, I had concerns about this super committee process. One of those concerns, unfortunately, is coming to pass. The automatic cuts that are slated to happen in 2013 because the super committee didn't act, as you said, are half military and half non-military. Well, again, there is fat at the Pentagon, and everything needs to be on the table. But the Pentagon defense is 17% of the budget. They're getting 50% of the cuts, and I think that's out of kilter.
And of course, we're in two wars right now, and we got Iran over there rattling their saber as loud as it can possibly be rattled, and threatening shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll dive into that later. But what do we do? I mean, it seems like a pretty bad time to be cutting the military.
Well, again, we need to get out of these automatic cuts, particularly when defense is 17% of the budget, gets 50% of the cuts, and do the real and the hard work ourselves.
David,
Congress.
Realistically, this being the election year, come November of 12, is anything going to happen?
Well, the conventional wisdom is certainly no, and that's really a shame. For two reasons. Number one, this is a ticking time bomb, and nobody knows when it's going to go off, and there's no guarantee that it can wait until next year. Number two, the other thing that's a shame about it is, while most folks think of divided government as being at complete loggerheads, everything gets stuck in the mud, it's also actually a unique opportunity to do some big things, to have the political atmosphere and the political cover, if you will, because everybody's part of the solution to do some big things on mandatory spending, on tax reform.
Excellent.
Things like that.
We'll continue this on the next show. We'll be right back on the next show. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. Our United States Senator David Vitter, thank you for being with us.